All right, so let's move on a little bit. Thinking next about coerced labor. Your question here is, which of the following coerced labor systems was outlawed by Spain in 1542 because it was deemed too cruel? Your options are chattel slavery, indentured servitude, the encomienda system, or the Mita system. As far as labor systems being outlawed, or coerced labor systems. Of course, coerced labor here, first of all, let's make sure we have that definition. It is labor or work that is gained through the use of force or threats. We've talked about, or your teachers have probably talked about a number of coerced labor systems in your class. Slavery being one of the oldest coerced labor systems and one that continues, is a continuity for most of history, right? We know that slavery existed thousands of years ago. We know that there are forms of slavery that exist today, whether it's wage slavery or actual slavery, human trafficking in our modern day. But the slave trade itself, or slavery in the Americas, is not really outlawed until the 19th century. And so A is incorrect because we're talking about 1542 here, which coincides with a series of laws called the New Laws issued by Spain. Indentured servitude is not outlawed. It continues well after 1542, although it mostly disappears for a while and eventually makes a comeback. So we're down to these last two systems. And the one that was deemed too cruel and because of the brutality and the poor conditions in which indigenous people were kept in was actually the encomienda system. So if you chose C, give yourself a pat on the back. Let's take a look at then this coerced labor and thinking about changes in continuities in this. First and foremost, let's think about a continuity. Somebody had asked about slavery on the African continent. And so kind of thinking outside of the Americas right now, which of course, if we look back to that essay question from 2015, this would not fit that geography because that question was only on the Americas. But if we think about a continuity of coerced labor kind of in the global system, which most questions nowadays will focus on the global system rather than a specific region. The first one is that slavery in Africa and the slave trade from Africa are a continuity in this time period. There are certainly going to be some changes in the slave trade with Africa, and I will talk about those in a moment. But the use of slaves within households in Africa and the slave trade into the Mediterranean region and the Indian Ocean had been occurring in some cases for thousands of years and was a continuity throughout this time period. So the slave trade with Arab slave traders across the Sahara Desert into the Indian Ocean, that is something that is going to keep happening in the early modern time period. Slaves will be sent into the Indian Ocean, will be sent into the Mediterranean for use in a variety of things, whether to work in homes as servants or to work in fields as agricultural labor. That is something we see pretty much throughout world history. What's important to understand is that the slave trade from Africa into the Mediterranean region and into the Indian Ocean doesn't simply stop because European slave traders start to trade slaves across the Atlantic Ocean. Certainly the numbers in the Atlantic slave trade easily surpass the rest of the African slave trade and the use of slavery in Africa. We're talking in the millions and millions and millions of people being sent into the Atlantic Ocean. But that certainly does not mean that it did not continue elsewhere. That's certainly not a justification for anything. We just want to make sure that we understand that this is an important continuity in slavery from our previous time periods into the early modern time period and even past this time period. So that's the first thing we want to think about. But let's move into changes because that's what you're all here for anyways. We're thinking then about changes in coerced labor, and the key concepts, I always mention these, right? I screenshotted this from the College Board's key concepts. There are changes in coerced labor. Almost all of this is in a response to the growing demand for goods and labor that coincide with the intensification of trade. Now, that's kind of a lot of big words there, so let's break it down. coerced labor, labor that is forced, threat of either through threats or actual force. These changes that we're going to talk about, the rise of certain coerced labor systems in the Americas, are a response to the growing trade. The fact that more people are trading, thus trade is intensifying. It means there's a greater demand for goods, both finished and raw material goods, and people have to produce those. The goods that are coming out of the Americas are predominantly going to be created or harvested by coerced labor. So one thing that we'll see is the growth of a plantation economy where cash crops are grown using slave labor. Initially, this was done with native labor enslaved, but because of the effects of disease and harsh treatment, Europeans turn elsewhere to bolster their numbers of laborers, and that is going to be Africa. Colonial economies, of course, in building this are going to depend on coerced labor, but a range of it. So there's four types of coerced labor that we're going to talk about here, and that is the Encomienda system, the Mita system, indentured servitude, and chattel slavery. So first, let's think about one major change, and this is especially in the Americas. With change and continuity essays, there is a way that you can frame almost any change, any piece of information as a change or continuity. So I'm presenting this encomienda system to you as a change, but I'm going to mention how it could be a continuity as well. So the encomienda system itself, first of all, let's just talk about what it is. The encomienda system was a system of labor whereby conquistadors, these Spanish conquerors, would conquer an area of land, and in exchange for gaining that land for the crown of Spain would be granted dominion over that land, granted control of that land, and anyone who was living on that land. By taking over this land and controlling the people who were on it, these conquistadors, who are now gigantic landowners, were free to exploit labor in that region. And of course, you can kind of see where this is going. They're free to exploit labor, basically do whatever they want there. We're going to see some pretty harsh treatment as they try to make money immediately after conquering the Americas. But this system was not new for the Spanish. It was new to the Americas. It was the first time that an outside group from Europe had really come to the Americas and enslaved the population. This system itself, this encomienda system, is perfected basically in Spain, in the Reconquista of Spain, as Spain conquers land fighting Muslim forces on the Iberian Peninsula. And what would happen is you'd conquer a bit of land, you would gain dominion over the Muslims there. Either they converted, or you killed them, or you kicked them out, and you were responsible for feeding them and teaching them in the ways of the Catholic faith in exchange for basically their slave labor. In the Americas, however, because this system was so far outside of the reach of the Spanish crown, there was really no way to regulate this. And so natives are treated extremely harshly. Some people take up their cause. For example, there are priests who kind of write to the Spanish crown on behalf of these enslaved peoples, talking about the brutality inherent in this system. And so as a result of this, Spain, understanding that this system was not easily regulated in the Americas because it was so far away, and because natives were dying in massive numbers, and the decline in population of Native Americans really made this system untenable, Spain outlaws this system and replaces it with alternate labor systems. The next change that we're going to see in coerced labor is still going to be this dependence, but it's going to be using perhaps a familiar system. Again, thinking about changes in continuities here, the encomienda continues from Spain, but is used in the Americas. It is new to the Americas, so we can frame it as a change. The Mita system as well could be framed as either a change or continuity. For example, the Mita system itself was developed by the Inca as a form of corvée labor, and the Spanish arrive realizing their encomienda system and their traditional labor models are not working. They want access, especially to mining silver. And so they adopt the Inca Mita system, which was this corvée system, basically labor as a tax, right? Instead of giving a certain amount of money or wheat, you gave a certain amount of labor. And so they demanded that villages provide a certain number of workers to the Spanish to especially mine silver. And you see the image here that I've chosen is of Potosi, which is the mountain of silver in South America that produces massive amounts of silver that eventually are minted in the Spanish peso de ocho, changing global commerce. But this change in this system, this use of this Mita system for the benefit of the Spanish, is an important labor change that we see in this time period. For some reason, I still have peasant agricultural labor at the top. We are talking about coerced labor here. I'm sorry about the heading at the top being incorrect. So let's think about a third change, or a third thing here that we see. And that is one that you may be more familiar with. That is the introduction of a specific type of coerced labor known as indentured servitude. Europeans use this to encourage the settlement of the Americas. Indentured servants were used for agricultural labor, but it was also used for artisan labor. So what would happen is an ad might be put out, and Europeans would advertise for a job in the Americas. If you went, you signed indentures, which was basically a contract saying that whoever was paying your journey over to the Americas would control you, basically, would be responsible for you for 7 years. And in return for this, you owed them labor. You owed them time. Now, you may earn a skill, but if you were going to the Caribbean, you may also be working on a sugar plantation, which was extremely harsh work, very difficult work. Certainly a lot of indentured servants run away. Ads are put into newspapers seeking these runaway indentured servants who are contractually obligated to fill out their terms of indenture. And as time goes on, Europe has a harder and harder time encouraging people to come to the Americas under indentures because of this exploitation that comes about. Because of this, eventually indentured servitude basically disappears in favor of the rise of chattel slavery. And the last and single biggest change, ending with the big one here, is the rise and proliferation of chattel slavery. Now, we use this term chattel slavery to really differentiate this type of slavery from what we may have seen in the rest of world history. Chattel is a word that simply means property. It is something that is owned by someone else. It also included kind of the idea of a hereditary component. Chattel slavery saw that, said basically that if your mother was a slave, then you were a slave, and that would happen in perpetuity. Chattel slavery is one of the most significant things that you need to understand in this time period. And so we're going to take a closer look at it right now. First of all, the growth of chattel slavery is facilitated by the rise of the Atlantic trade system. That is the rise of an Atlantic slave trade. There is a forced migration of Africans to the Americas, predominantly from West Africa. And this is heavily connected with the growing demand for sugar in the world. We also see demographic changes. And that happens in the Americas and Africa, right? So the African population in the Americas will rise. This, of course, becomes significant because the native population in the Americas, especially in Caribbean islands, drops drastically as a result of European diseases and harsh treatment. And so we'll see that rise in African population. In Africa itself, we see a massive gender imbalance. Most of the slaves taken to the Americas, especially the Caribbean, were men. Men were constantly being brought over, not to expand necessarily the plantation economy, which was happening, but simply to replace slaves who were dying in this production. Women take on much greater roles in West Africa. They themselves begin taking on becoming heads of households, dealing with agriculture in West Africa. So that's a major effect. Of course, population decline is also an effect. In some areas of sub-Saharan Africa, we see a significant drop in population. Now, the African continent as a whole, their estimates vary. Some say there is a dip in population. Some say that the population growth simply slowed because of the introduction of new American foods that helped offset the slave trade. Now, sugarcane is not the only cash crop these slaves grew. Certainly, they grew subsistence crops, they grew foodstuffs, they grew tobacco, but the sugarcane really is the industry that drives this change in labor. And again, it is a change. We're thinking change in continuities. This intensification of slavery was a labor system change.